Well, good morning from my side as well, and thank you very much for inviting us to come here. It's a great pleasure to talk about, I think, the very important issues, and I will follow straight from the autonomy to the funding models. And as Stefano already pointed out, there's a very strong link between the governance and the autonomy of institutions and the funding. So I will also try to link those two concepts in my talk. Before I start with moving also to give the comparison on how the crisis has impacted also in other countries, I would like to talk a bit about some common trends, how universities across Europe are funded. Now, this pie chart shows data from our UD study, a study that we've been undertaking with well over 200 universities from over 20 countries across Europe. And this shows the average income structure of institutions. So what you see here, 2/3 of the funding still comes from public sources. But within that funding stream, you have many, many different sources from public funding, be it competitive, be it block grants, formula funding, etc. The next funding streams here on average, 9% comes from student fees, but of course this is very, very diverse according to the country that you look at. For example, in the UK, I will show that in more detail, you have 25% of an income coming through that. Interesting, I think, the next one, on average, you have universities have 6% coming from contracts with business and industry, mostly, of course, through research activities, and then on average between roughly around 4% through either philanthropic funding, through service-related income. That means when universities use their assets by using their facilities, renting their facilities, and consultancy activities. And last but not least, European funding is also a very important part in many university systems as an income source. Now, this is the average. If you look at two systems, I mean, I've chosen one at UK universities, they have a very complete different income structure. You can see only a quarter of their income comes from public sources, almost a quarter comes from student fees, and also a very high share of contracts with business and industry, as well as philanthropic funding. Next to that, you see the Austrian system. I think this is a very interesting case, because Austria used to be a country, if you looked at that 10 years ago, I think they would probably have scored very similar in the scorecard than Greece. It was a very centralized system, little freedom for the institutions, and now, today, this system has a much higher degree of autonomy, and I think that's also, you see, reflected in their income structure. Still, 2/3 of the funding comes from public sources. Austria has also abandoned fees. There are only fees if students study longer. But what you can see here, they already have a higher income from contracts with business and industry, and also a higher income through philanthropic funding and European funding. So here you can see the autonomy has had an impact in a system also on the funding structure. And of course, all systems ask themselves the question, how do we find the right balance of these different funding models? How do we decide on our public funding model? How do we deliver public funding to institutions? Who's going to pay for it? And that is, of course, the question where there is no single answer to it, because it very much depends on the economic situation, on the culture, and on the socio-economic environment. So there will be no single model where we can recommend this is how to do it, so you always have to look at the context. So if I take Norway, for example, where you would, if I had shown you a pie, that would show that there's a very high percentage of public funding, but of course the economic situation of Norway is a very different one than many European countries find themselves in. also, when you look at the different possibilities to create income, it is clear that the biggest shift between public funding and those other sources of funding you can do through tuition fees. We've also seen the variation from around 35% today in the UK and 0% in Norway. So you see there is a huge variety. The other sources, I think there is also great potential in many countries, but of course those sources take time that you can build them up. And I will talk a little bit later about that, what would be success factors to build up on these other sources. Another important aspect, so the current project that we're looking at, is efficiency. I would say that almost all countries in Europe look at efficiency, also on the question, how can universities do more with less money, unfortunately in the most cases, or at least do more with the same. So the question is also on efficiency, huge pressure in many countries. Now, this shows our funding observatory, where we've been monitoring for over 5 years now the development of public funding across Europe. And what you can see here, those little circles show those countries. You have a lot of data within this funding tool. So you have also, if you're interested how other countries fare, you can have a look and see this on our website. But from the color coding, you can already see you have south and east of Europe more red, that means high cuts, and more in the north and in the middle, Central Europe still green, that means those countries would still invest in higher education. So again, you have a separation of Europe between north-south, which of course will pose great challenges for a common Europe. Now, if you look at the different countries, this shows the cuts in public funding between 2008 and 2012. And you see actually quite a lot of red. That means we do have a number of countries that have similar challenges as you have here. The country that cut most was Latvia. They had really high cuts. In that period, also Hungary, looking from 2000 to 2012, had enormous cuts. And then, of course, we have Greece in this period as well. Just for an explanation, the graphs, we also have corrected for inflation, so that also makes the factor then even higher. So this is also something that we think is important to take account of. So you see the picture across Europe is not too positive, but of course you also have some countries that have overall in this period invested in higher education and research. Now, the Greek situation, if I take also the time now, in addition from 2008 to 2013, very high cuts. Just to give you also an indication on the number, we've collected those numbers from our national rectors' conferences, and of course sometimes you have very different ways of calculating, so it's not about to also give you the 100% precise numbers. It very much depends on what you calculate into the figure, but I think the dimension shows the direction. We've also seen from Greece between 2012 and 2013 the country that cut the most, and that is of course something already in a period where you had very high cuts before. Also, as I mentioned before, high inflation in 2008, 2010 and 2011, which is also making the situation even worse than without looking at that. So I think what's very important also in this dialogue is the outlook, because of course in many countries universities had faced difficult periods, but if you face a difficult period already for a period of 5 years and longer, then this has a long-term impact as well. So it will be very important in the discussion, in the debate, to get a long-term vision on how you will design your funding system. This is also something we would like to give you as a message, that you, in order to have a long-term planning, you need to have a certain amount of security and clarity. Now, how do other countries deal with that? As you've seen, many countries facing these problems, but we can also see that in a number of countries, it is the institutions themselves that have to apply these cuts. So that means the block grant has been cut for a certain amount, and it's the institution that decides then where they need to cut, be it on certain research activities that they slow down, be it on certain programs that they slow down, be it on additional activities that they cut, etc. So it's up to the institution to decide where they do cuts. In a number of countries, also those who have civil servants as their staff, this is also, we have seen, impact on cuts or changes to the civil servant status. They had to face salary reductions, less holiday, longer working hours. These are things that we have seen in many, many countries. On the other side, on the system level, we've also seen some countries where governments and funders provided incentives to institutions that they also look for other sources of funding. For example, in Ireland also faced very, very challenging situations with cuts to the general block grant. But here, the Higher Education Funding Authority provided certain pots of money that would give incentives to institutions to attract other funds or sources. We've also seen in a number of countries the reaction to develop differentiated tuition fees, be it either that you increase fees for international students or that you increase fees also for national students. So Spain has, for example, gone down that route. And I would see in all countries a strong push for also looking at internal efficiency measures. And I will talk a little bit about that in a minute, what they can be. Now, it's clear that not one single measure will provide a solution or will change the very difficult situation to a more comfortable one. It is something that one needs to look at, as I already said earlier, globally. So you can't have just one single measure that will solve the situation. Now, it's clear that it's a very, very difficult situation. I just want to stress a couple of challenges, certainly. When you have to face high cuts, of course, the question is how do you keep or improve the quality of your teaching and research activities during that period? The most important thing is that we've seen all institutions, what they are concerned and worried about is that the long-term quality is damaged through cuts. So that is certainly one challenge. Another challenge is cuts are very short-term measures, and how do you manage to keep a long-term vision and a long-term reform when you have only those short-term cuts that you have to deal with? A third challenge is how can you invest in future activities, how can you invest in reform processes when at the same time there are cuts? Because also the experience from many of our studies is when you undertake reforms, they also need investment, because in order to be fruitful, you need to invest to reap the benefits afterwards. Also, staff development. Staff is a very crucial issue in changing systems and reform processes. How do you invest in staff development when you have to deal with cuts? So those are the challenges. But of course, we also seen in many countries that they've used this as opportunities, as an opportunity to restructure systems, which is not an easy thing. This is in no country an easy task. So these outside pressures can also seen as opportunities. And I think this is how we work a lot with our systems, is to see a benchmark with other countries, to look at how are other countries doing, how our countries with similar problems, with similar issues, have found ways out of the crisis, or also to look at what didn't work in other countries. This is also something that we think is very important to learn in the process. So the main message already at this stage is, within the dialogue, within the process, that you need to look at the long-term perspective. Where do you want to stand in the 10 years time, and what do you need to get there? That is, I think, is very important to not forget about that when you, of course, evidently you have to deal short-term with very difficult situations. Now, towards the end, I would like to tell you a couple of things that come out from our studies and show you first what we think public authorities can do to help the process, to change the funding systems in order to help institutions. So first of all, there are incentives in public funding to increase private funding. This is quite a common tool in many higher education funding systems. So many countries use funding formula, and there is, of course, an increase towards moving towards more outputs. So it's not just that you look at the inputs, the number of students that go into higher education, but how many students come out of the system, how many degrees do you produce, how much research do you undertake, etc. So that is something that is used quite commonly. A second tool that is used very commonly are performance contracts. These are contracts whereby the government or the funder engages with the institutions to agree on certain targets that the institutions should arrive. And this is something that has been also used very successfully in a number of countries because, again, it sort of fosters a dialogue between the institutions. And certainly I think the size of the Greek system would allow to use such a system, which also shows much more as a dialogue than a top-down approach. A second important part we have seen in many countries is, if you want to attract other sources of funding, of course institutions need to have very efficient, very good financial tools. So the upgrade and capacity building in financial management is a key success factor to arrive at this point. A third element we've seen in a number of countries is that institutions benefit from having smart funding incentives. That means governments, funders design schemes that it's more attractive for institutions to look for other sources of funding. So, for example, fundraising activities, we have matched funding schemes whereby the government matches every euro raised by institutions with either a euro themselves. That's very successful in the countries that have used them, England, Wales, Norway, Austria, for example. That also helped. Again, I have to say, of course, this doesn't change the whole system, but it's an element that helps to get a start attracting other sources. One key factor, and that was very, very clear from the study that we've undertaken, the study that I mentioned at the beginning, where we looked at over 200 universities, leadership development is one of the key success factors. Without the support of the leadership, many of these efforts will not be successful. Leadership development is key to change in the institution, to reinforce the strategic approach, and of course to implement the income generation strategy in a successful way. But that doesn't mean we're only talking about the top leadership. It needs to go throughout the institution. So it needs to be also in the faculties and institutes, because the academic community needs to be very much on board to help with the income generation. Human resource development, I already mentioned it a number of times. We have seen that, of course, changing a system, making reforms also require that you change the staff in a certain way, because if previously you received the majority of your funding from government, then of course it was not necessary that you had certain staff in your institution. Well, if this changes, staff needs to take different activities. If you want to increase your contracts, your research contracts with business and industry, you also not only need the research capacity and skills, but you also need the people who are able to negotiate, to have the knowledge about IPR, etc. So that is a very important part. And the third point, and I think this is also very important, and mirrors, I think, also what Stefano said before, it's important to look at the next generation. This is something that in countries, particularly in the north of Europe, they have been doing very successfully, by also making schemes that makes it attractive for the next generation to also move into taking responsibility and in the governance of the institutions. So this is also something we believe is a success factor in moving forward. The last point on authorities I want to mention is that efficiency measures should not be something that should be pressed on institutions, but you can also do this in a way through incentives. And one way of doing that is through targeted funding. We've seen examples in Ireland, the UK, but also in Germany, Austria, in a number of countries, whereby the funders put a certain amount of money, and institutions can compete for that, and they will get the money if they improve governance structures, etc. So there's a whole variety of possibilities that you have. For example, in Ireland, they have used this fund to develop financial management capacities within the institutions. That has been very successful. So not an enormous amount of money for the government, but very successful in the impact. We also see in a number of countries a stronger push towards cooperation between the institutions through sharing facilities, sharing equipment, sharing IT services. So this is something which I think we will see in a number of countries. And here, this can also be done through incentives. We see also outsourcing of services and public procurement. This is something where you can certainly make efficiencies through a very intelligent way. Of course, you always need to look what fits best for the situation, what fits best for this environment. And last but not least, and I think this is also something we've seen in a number of countries, data collection and benchmarking has been a very strong driver to drive efficiencies, whereby you also compare amongst yourself why is an institution doing very well in a certain area and can you maybe copy that. So this is something learn from the others, but you need comparable data for that. Now, I've been talking a lot about the authorities, but of course it also means that the institutions themselves have a role in developing this, and particularly when looking for other income sources, it's important that this is done in a strategic way. This is not something that is successful done if it happens here and there. The successful examples very strongly come out from our study are those institutions that have a strategy, that they're also those institutions that look where are our strengths, where can we combine our main missions with opportunities to attract funding in certain research areas, etc. Where do we have connections with potential sponsors, etc. So the whole range of income generation needs to be looked at in an analytical way. Of course, success will not come without investment in people, leadership and management. So here you have to mirror what I said, governments and funders can support. This is also something that needs to be done within the institutions. Without the investment in staff and leadership, it will also not have that success that it could have. One point I would also stress is very important the communication. We have seen in the successful universities, they had a very strong focus to integrate also the whole academic community to make the case why this is an important part, because of course income generation is not an aim in itself, but it feeds and helps to support the main activities and main missions of universities in teaching and research and innovation activities. So that is something, the communication and making the case why this is important is a very successful tool. The last point I want to make is something I think that you've heard from all three of us today, is the dialogue. The successful reform process should involve the main actors. That is, of course, in most cases, the relevant ministry and the relevant funders and the universities, the actors, but also, of course, the representative bodies like the rectors' conferences. And any reform will not be successful if there is no joint dialogue, if there isn't a coordinated approach, and if there isn't a communication between the different actors. So this is certainly our recommendation for a long-term successful reform process, to really think about this process. And this is not just about designing a reform, this is also very important in the implementation process. So this is not just something to discuss when designing a law, it's also about the implementation. And of course this is what I think we all wish to you, that you can also move into this coordinated dialogue. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy for any questions.